support her. Thank you. We've also got support afterwards as well, Anthony Hemingway from RBA, who are the consultants engaged by council to prepare the heritage study that informed this piece of work. So the purpose of tonight's session is going to provide you information on the proposed heritage controls. It will provide information on the context and reasons for those controls. And you'll also have the opportunity to understand these changes and seek some further information as well. Next slide, please. So by way of background, we are engaged to help council run these online sessions. The sessions is going to be, this session is going to be split into two main parts. The main part is really to the presentations from Sophie and Anthony, which will provide you an overview of the proposed planning scheme amendment. And council will explain how that amendment came about, what is being proposed and what it will mean. They will also explain their role and obligations to protect heritage. Then we'll have the opportunity to hear from Anthony, understand his methodology and approach in preparing the study. And at that point, after that point, we'll be going into responding to questions. As part of the registration for this session, we ask you to send through any questions you might have. And we have received, we've received those and have been able to prepare for them, and we'll have about 30 minutes at the end to hear council's responses to these questions. If you do have any additional questions as well, please feel free to put them in the chat. We do ask that you sort of put your attention to and your focus on the presentation as we go through. Some of your questions may well be answered through that. Once those are done, any further questions, if you want to put them in the chat, and we'll be dealing with them then. The other thing I just wanted to note on that as well, tonight's session is not going to be about responding to questions on specific individual properties. We can talk to general questions about the proposed control and process. And we'll be also, before we finish tonight, wrapping up with next steps in terms of more detail about how you can provide your feedback and submissions or get in contact with council. And just a note on that, the council have extended the dates for formal submissions until Friday the 15th of October, but we'll come back to that later and give you all the information and the context details about how to make submissions or find more information. Thanks. Next slide, please. So I know that many of us have been doing video conferencing more than probably previously for the last 18 months, but just as a reminder, a few tips for today. Your microphones should be on mute as we go through this session, just to make sure everyone can clearly hear the presenters. We invite you to use the chat function to ask any questions, as I said, but if you could ideally wait until the presentations are done to do that, because it could be that the information you're after is actually going to be coming up in those presentations. And also, as we go through the session, please be respectful and considerate of everyone's time and your time, and we hope that we have a productive meeting. That's it from me. I'll be back later in the session, but I'd now like to hand over to Sophie Jordan. She's Acting Coordinator of Strategic Planning at Darebin City Council. And we'll provide a bit more detail about Thornbury Park Heritage Estate and proposed planning scheme. And then we'll hear from Anthony from RBA. And at that point, after that point, we'll get to your questions. Okay, thank you, Sophie.
Thanks very much, Ross, and hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us here this evening. We do much prefer to do these events in person, but we are not able to at the moment, so thanks for spending this time with us. So as Ross mentioned, I'm the Acting Coordinator of Strategic Planning, and I'll be talking a bit about the process that this amendment is going through and a bit more info. we know that this proposal has generated a lot of community interest, and so we're hoping that tonight can provide you with information about what's proposed and how it impacts you and how you can have your say. Next slide, thanks, Jess. So I want to start with the big picture about why heritage is important and why council's wanting to protect heritage. And I want to preface this by acknowledging that different kinds of heritage have different kinds of value in our current systems, and we want to acknowledge the kind of shortfalls that exist in current systems. So heritage that's post settlement is much better protected than sort of Aboriginal cultural heritage, and council has a really strong commitment to First Nations and to addressing the injustices of the past, and so we want to acknowledge that context across all of our projects. We do know that these, this newer heritage also has importance and value. And we hear often from our community about the importance of these heritage places, and council's often asked to do more to protect these places. So the Borough Charter is a sort of national level document that defines the principles and procedures for conservation in Australia. And I want to read a very short quote from the Borough Charter, which kind of sums up the importance of heritage. So, places of cultural significance enrich people's lives. They are historical records that are important expressions of Australian identity and experience. They reflect the diversity of our communities, telling us about who we are and the past that has formed us in the Australian landscape. They are irreplaceable and precious. So again, we hear directly from the community about the importance of these places, and we want to ensure they're protected into the future. Council also has a legislative responsibility to enhance and conserve heritage places, and this is under the Planning and Environment Act. So where we become aware of, we've got a duty to, ensure that places are protected. We know that there are gaps in Darebin in our heritage protection, so we are going through a process to progressively, update the controls and ensure that those heritage places are protected. So this amendment is one piece of that, and there's another amendment on foot for Heidelberg Road in the south of the municipality. For Thornbury Park Estate, we've also had a detailed heritage study undertaken, which Anthony from RBA is going to speak to this evening. And that has identified this precinct as having historical significance. Next slide, thanks, Jess. So what is Thornbury Park Estate? I won't spend too much time on this because Anthony is going to talk a bit more about the historical importance of the estate, but you will be aware of the boundaries of it by now with the maps that have been sent out, and you can see there the location of it in the municipality. And the precinct essentially is the original subdivision of the Thornbury Park Estate, which Anthony will speak some more about. This is a timeline for the project and what sort of happened the last couple of years to bring us to where we are now. So in mid-2019, Council undertook an initial heritage assessment of the precinct, and that shortly after sought interim protections, and also resolved at the same time to do further work. And that's the further work that Anthony and his team did over last year, which has kind of given more research and defined the boundaries and significance of the heritage precinct. And it was in April of this year that Council decided to proceed with the amendment and to proceed with commencing a process to introduce the heritage overlay. And that's what we're now consulting on. I won't go into the next steps now. I'll touch on that at the end of the presentation. So what is council proposing? This is kind of the technical summary of what council's proposing. So we are proposing a planning scheme amendment. So we're proposing to change the planning controls to Thornbury Park, the Thornbury Park Estate area, to permanently introduce a heritage overlay. We will also be seeking to incorporate a statement of significance for Thornbury Park Estate into the scheme, which sort of details what is significant about the precinct and what should be protected and regarded in permit applications. And then there's a few sort of technical and consequential changes to the scheme as well. So where and how will those changes be applied? Many of you will have received this map or be familiar with this map. It was sent out to landowners and occupiers in the precinct. So all of the properties within those boundaries are proposed to be included in the heritage overlay. There are different gradings. So there are 3 kinds of gradings, being significant, contributory, non-contributory. There's about 5 significant properties within the precinct, and about 70% of the precinct is considered contributory, and around 30% is considered non-contributory. And on the next slide this is a bit of an explanation of those gradings. So the significant properties in Thornbury Park Estate are both individually significant and significant in terms of the precinct. So they are both, have value in and of themselves, and they also contribute to the heritage value of the broader area. The contributory properties, these are ones that may not have individual significance when they're considered on their own, but they contribute to the heritage value of the broader precinct. Non-contributory buildings are those that may not be original dwellings, or they may have been altered to such an extent that they don't contribute to the heritage value any longer. The reason the heritage overlay is applied to these properties is to ensure that any new development is respectful of the heritage significance of the precinct. As part of this process, council has also applied what's called an interim heritage overlay. So this has been applied only to significant and contributory buildings or properties, and it's a standard approach across Victoria where there is development pressure. So we have seen that there is development pressure in Thornbury Park Estate over the past few years. And what this interim heritage overlay does is that it prevents demolition of dwellings while permanent controls are being considered. And that's to try and prevent a loss of the heritage value that we're trying to protect through this process. And under the interim heritage overlay, a planning permit is required in a similar way to the permanent heritage overlay. So we know that there are some people who are affected by this, the interim heritage overlay. If you're in that circumstance and you're not in touch with us already, please do contact us to discuss your circumstances, because they do vary, and we'll need to sort of look into your specific site and what you're proposing and how far along the process you are, and can provide you with kind of specific advice to your circumstances. So the heritage overlay, it doesn't mean that you can't do anything with your property. There are still frequently renovations that take place and extensions, even some demolitions in a heritage overlay area. So it doesn't mean that nothing can happen to your property. It does mean you need to apply for planning permission from council for most external changes. And the restrictions vary based on whether you're a significant and contributory or a non-contributory. So for significant and contributory buildings, demolition is discouraged. Rear extensions are generally permitted, but they need to be respectful of the surrounding area. And for non-contributory buildings, demolition is generally permitted, and new development, as I said earlier, needs to be sympathetic to the surrounding area. And there are exemptions for some minor changes, like changes to the rear of a building that won't impact on the street. Decks, pergolas, things like that don't need planning permission. We've had a few questions about what the planning process looks like. So this is a bit of a summary of that. Before you lodge an application, we encourage you to meet with council officers to talk through your plans. And at that meeting, one of our officers can provide you with preliminary feedback. And that's to really flag any major issues before you lodge an application. There's no cost to do that, and you're able to book that through our website. After that, you lodge an application. So we require plans and a report. There's an initial assessment undertaken against the requirements of the scheme, and the cost to lodge an application varies based on the cost of the proposed development. So it's $202 for works that are less than $10,000 in value, and then up to $1,500 for a development that will cost more than $1 million. Council may request further information. So if there's something missing that council needs to be able to make an assessment, they'll then request further information, and that information is then submitted. The time frame for council making a decision is 60 days. We aim to make a decision in that time. If we need to request further information, it pauses that 60-day time frame. So after that, again, this doesn't happen with all applications, but it may be required, is advertising. So you may have seen there's like people put up a yellow sign in front of the site, and letters are sent to the neighbouring properties informing them of the proposal and inviting any submissions. So the neighbours or other affected parties can lodge objections to the proposal. And the cost of advertising is around $170, and that can increase if there's more people that need to be notified. So following the advertising period, council makes its decision. So the objections are considered. Council assesses the application against the requirements of the scheme and then makes a decision. And that decision could be to refuse the permit or grant the permit with conditions. And following council's decision, there is a sort of avenue for appeal by both the applicant or the landowner or an objector. So if you don't agree with council's decision, or you want to contest a condition of the approval, or if you don't agree with a refusal, then that you can appeal that to VCAT, and VCAT will consider the application and make their own decision. We've also had some queries about how the application will be assessed. So there's policy at different levels within the planning scheme. So at a state level, there's broad policy to conserve and enhance heritage places. And we'll post this presentation online, and we have to click the hyperlinks. And then at a local level, we have policy to discourage demolition, retain those important heritage elements, and ensure new development is sympathetic to the surrounding area. We then get to the heritage overlay. So at that stage, that grading of the property is important. So any proposed impact, any impact of the proposal on the significance of the property is considered, as well as the appearance, location, and bulk form of the development. The statement of significance identifies the parts of the precinct that are of heritage value, and the application is also considered in the context of those things and the impact of the proposal on those important elements. So I think I'll now hand over to Anthony to talk a bit more about the heritage study. Thanks, Anthony.
Thanks, Sophie. My name's Anthony Hemingway. I was the leader of the team who were engaged by council to review this precinct, or the possibility of this precinct. It had been raised in a couple of earlier reports, and we reviewed all that material in the way we normally do. We have extensive experience working in Melbourne and across the state doing these types of heritage studies, and the standard methodology was applied that's mostly outlined in the Victorian government's applying the heritage overlay planning practice note. And also, you know, as Sophie has mentioned before, the Borough Charter, that's a very important document which underlies a lot of most heritage thinking. So it outlines principles and processes for assessing heritage and managing it. And so we follow that as well. Next slide, thanks. So the methodology of the heritage study. And the initial thing to do is inspect the area, walk around it, look at all the buildings. We photograph them, so we've got a record of them. We're frequently going back to those photographs in our assessment process. We also look at the adjacent streets just to kind of confirm what the boundary was, whether could have been, if there's similar properties elsewhere, etc. As the stock that was in the defined boundary. We undertook a lot of archival research. We look at historic photographs, books, maps, and any newspaper articles in an online resource called Trove that's available through the National Library. So, you know, there's a lot of resources that are available. The next part is to assess the precinct and the heritage values against the HERCON criteria. And I'll come to those a bit more, but there are 8 of those. And these criteria are widely used across the state and the country. Further inspections were taken during the time when maybe some of our photographs weren't great and we couldn't quite see things. And also it's very important with such a large precinct, I guess, to review it and just make sure we're confident about the consistency and the character of the streetscapes. We also, part of the process is to compare it to other precincts already in the municipality. So we looked at this precinct had buildings from the Federation and Interwar periods and post-war periods. So we also compared with other precincts with building fabric from those same periods. Another part is to do all the gradings. Sophie's mentioned the definitions about those, whether they're significant, contributory or non-contributory. And the final part is preparing the statement of significance, outlining what is and why and how it is significant. So really distilling the significance into this statement. Next slide, thanks. Yeah. So just a quick overview of the history post-settlement. This part of the municipality was sold off very early as very large farming allotments of, you know, in the order of nearly 200 acres. Job Smith came to acquire a lot of land in this area, and he had very large holdings, which he retained for most of the 19th century. He established a farmhouse on the hill, you know, at the end of Smith Street, kind of near Hill Street, and that survived well into the mid-20th century. And the land remained, his holdings actually went as far east as High Street, but he sold off the parts between St. George's Road and High Street during the late 19th, early 20th century. And some little bit of development happened in those areas. But the rest of it basically just stayed as a huge farm holding until the early 20th century. Next slide. So there was impetus. This part of the municipality was relatively inaccessible, and it wasn't until the train and the tram lines in the early 20th century were established that it provided an impetus for subdivision. So the subdivision occurs in 1911, and it's nearly all of the precinct area. The only part that isn't is sort of the bottom kind of southwest corner, but that was in another subdivision that occurred at the same time, about Smith's original house. So this very large estate was advertised widely, and there were a series of sales. It was offered mainly as for working class individuals, and there were housing packages available by the builders Dunlop and Hunt, who were active across Melbourne doing that similar sort of work. So there's an example of the kind of housing that Dunlop and Hunt produced down the bottom there. So yeah, the next slide. The Federation period one. Do we skip the Federation? Yeah, that was, sorry, the Federation, the next one, sorry, Jess. So during the interwar, during the Federation period, there's a bit of development. It's mainly at the east end of the precinct up towards St. George's Road. That's where most of the Federation period houses are, but it really kicks off in the 20s with the tram lines and the electrification of the train line. And a lot of the housing dates to the interwar period, mostly the 1920s. Most of the land had been sold by then. And throughout that period, it continued to attract a lot of working class families, able to build modest homes. Other local builders are known to be active in the precinct were Stewart and Davies. And also some of the houses came about through the State Savings Bank scheme. And there's a rare example of a photo we have of a house, soon after its completion. This house dates to the 1920s, but this photo was taken in 1932. And what's interesting here is you see the original fence type, which would have been very common throughout the precinct, but actually not that many survive. And you also get to see the fact that the houses had tiled roofs, both this one and the one next door, whereas sometimes that's been replaced with corrugated iron. And you also sort of see some of the colour schemes that were used. So the dark framing around the windows, as well as the light coloured sashes. And the type of driveway with the concrete driveway too. Next, yeah, thanks. So during this aerial here is sort of up the west end of the precinct, mainly from sort of Comus Grove, just Straddle Street. And you see to the right of Comus Grove there, that it's quite, most of the blocks have been built upon. There's only a couple I can see quickly in there that aren't. Whereas west of Comus Grove, the development was patchy, mainly just along Comus Grove. But yes, Strettle Street was really sort of ill-defined at that point, and the extensions of Fife, etc., through from Comus Grove. And down the bottom there, just below where you can see Hill Street, is Job Smith's house. Was still surviving. So that's just down here. So most of the development, though, is completed by 1956 in the precinct area. During the post-war period, that is after World War II, most of the houses are brick, whereas during the earlier, most of the houses are timber, though during that's up to the 10s and the 1920s. During the 1930s, there's sort of a shift to brick housing generally in the precinct. And you see some of that along Comus Grove and Miller Street, for instance, and scattered examples elsewhere. Also, yeah, there's a couple of two-storey houses down in the west end. So just a bit of an overview of some of the kind of standard and types of housing across the precinct. So the one on the left there at 92 Smith Street is a sort of a classic Federation style house. It's got this asymmetric frontage. It's got a gable end with battens, the vertical boards, and most likely rough cast sheeting in between. It's got casement windows to that projecting bay and a hood. There's a timber frieze and posts. And the chimneys you can see are rendered and got a brick cap, often with the terracotta pots, as in that one. Whether or not this, I don't know offhand, but this house may well have had a terracotta roof earlier too. So the top one above, there's Hutton Street. And even though it dates to the 1920s, it's sort of a bit of a transitional between a Federation and a interwar house. The pitch is still a bit steeper than your average bungalow, as you see to the right. And it has a timber porch as well. Whereas the next one there on to the right, oh, sorry, I just have to fix something there. Lost contact on my computer. At 24 Keene Street, this is a kind of a classic bungalow. It has a kind of an L-shaped footprint with a long ridge to the street and a large sort of porch gable end. Usually the porch, even though the house is weatherboard or timber framed, the porch usually is masonry with a wall or piers and one timbered posts, like they'll cement posts, piers at the top, the tapered ones. We also notice there's some unusual helical ones or spiraling ones in the precinct. Down the bottom there is an example of some of the interwar commercial buildings. So they're along Miller Street and there's a few along St. George's Road. This is an unusual pair where you get to see the roof, it's expressed, and there's the little dormers. At 31 Comus Grove, that's sort of a typical example of a 1930s house, so that they're mostly brick by that point. This is an example with some modern style detailing. It's got the curved corner porch and the prominent chimney at the front. And the last one to the right dates to the 1950s in what's called the Tudor Revival style, which was popular at the end of the war and after World War II. And it's sort of indicative. It has the characteristic steep pitch roof and with a corbelling and at the time, the clinker brick and often with some tapestry brick. So these multicolored or special textured bricks were used around the openings. We also see that at 31A Comus Grove, the use of tapestry bricks just above the entrance, the openings there in the porch. Next slide. So why is the Thornbury Park significant? Through our work, we came to assess it according to 3 criteria. So criteria is A, relates to historical significance. This is because it was a very, it has a lot of consistent housing stock and it's developed in quite a rapid time frame, mainly late 1910s through most of the 20s. And it reflects the rapid consolidation of Thornbury as a residential suburb at that time. The second point is criteria D. So that relates to the building stock. A lot of it's sort of representative. So it's just represents good, generally intact examples from the key periods of significance, being the late Federation, interwar and post-war periods. And in relation to criteria E, so that relates to aesthetic significance. So the 5 houses that were the kind of more notable ones in the precinct, they reflect a higher level of design and they were So on that, as for those houses, they better relate to that aesthetic significance. And there's an example of one of the 5 significant places in the precinct, the 33 Combs Grove. Next slide, Jeff. So just a bit of an overview about the potential for change. Sophie's already outlined some of this, but just from the planning scheme side, but also just to provide a bit more information about that. So important, and you'll be able to click on the hyperlinks and to click on some of the relevant documents. But the incorporated plan is a very important one. It outlines some of the key decisions for permit applications and exemptions. As has already been outlined, alterations and changes to non-contributory buildings are generally straightforward. Alterations, however, to contributory and significant buildings require an assessment for the most part. It's important that they remain, to protect the overall heritage values of the precinct, that the alterations aren't made which overwhelm or really change the appearance of the front of the place. So it's important that they're kept to the rear generally and or not visible from the public realm. There's still plenty of opportunity to make changes, however. Alterations to the 5 significant places would generally be more closely scrutinised and might require a kind of more intense amount of, or limited, even less visibility than maybe some of the contributory places. Alterations to the front facades of any graded building, either contributory or significant, would generally not be supported. Next slide. So just a quick overview of the fences, because that can be a concern for people. There's not many of the Y-type ones that survive as on the left, but this would have been the standard type in the precinct for most of those bungalows. Also, the Federation period houses would have probably generally had a timber picket fence. Probably we didn't really see, unlikely to have seen any original ones, but many have been rebuilt in a very kind of sympathetic way to the original type of the house. And some of the later interwar period houses from the 30s and those post-war typically have a low brick fence, or maybe it's a rendered fence or brick and render. So they're the main original fences, these brick ones that survive in the precinct. Otherwise, you know, just something complementary would be the main approach taken, should be taken. Next slide, yeah. So it's just an overview of a couple of the approach to sympathetic additions to a contributory or significant place. So an example at 148 Hutton Street, which is a contributory grading. This has been set back behind the original main front part of the house. So it's behind the main ridge line. It has fairly low visibility. It's set back in line with the side wall. So from the public realm, we can see it on this tangential view, but from directly in front, this has very low visibility. And so this is a good example of an approach where you can maybe achieve a second story to the rear, but it's being set behind the main part of the buildings helps to kind of keep the consistency of the original streetscapes. On this one example at 197's Hutton Street, this is a small scale one to the rear, which would not be visible from the front. Obviously, it's visible from the side, but broadly, that is a very sympathetic approach to additions. Next one. A couple of examples where demolition would be straightforward. So all the non-contributory buildings, any of those that are dated later than 1960, and the other types of non-contributory buildings are original ones which have been heavily altered, either with unsympathetic changes to the front or a domineering addition. It doesn't, however, mean that they can't be brought back and reconstructed, or if someone was to reconsider the additions to this, it could be set back much further, and that so a much more sympathetic outcome could be achieved. Next slide. A couple of examples of sympathetic infill. So an important thing that's achieved with this one at 91 Miller Street is it reflects the asymmetrical design that you find in most of the buildings in the precinct. So the two halves aren't mirrored, as we see in many townhouses, but this has quite a difference between the two sides. Also, furthermore, it's been inset from the side boundaries at first floor level, so it reduces the bulk of the upper level, the impact of the bulk of the upper level. The one on the right at 42 Fife Street, whilst a single residence and still slightly taller than the adjacent ones, the second story has been kind of concealed, I guess, within a larger roof. But overall, the mass, and with the massing towards the centre of the site, the impact is relatively minor on the streetscape. So here's another good sort of potential approach to including a second story in a building in the precinct, which mostly has single story housing stock. Next slide. So that was the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Anthony. And thanks everyone for patiently listening through those two presentations from Anthony and Sophie. To update you on the ways to make a formal submission, you'll see the information on the screen there. You can send it via post to Strategic Planning, PO Box 91, Preston, Vic 3072. Visit the website at www.yoursaydarabin.com.au or by emailing the team at planningservices@darabin.vic.gov.au. If you are putting a submission in, please include your name, address, and contact details in the submission. Next slide, please. So the sorts of things what you can include in your submission is obviously views on the amendment, if you either support or concerns around the amendment, and particularly how it would affect you, what you would like changed, outline any changes that you might request, such as changing the grading of your property or removing your property from the heritage overlay. Heritage information, if you have it, including information about alterations to the front of your property, and any other relevant useful documentation you might wish council to consider. And I just want to make a point here that there's a large amount of case law that supports that the following two things are not relevant considerations for council when it's determining whether to include a property in the heritage overlay. And that is any potential impact on property value or the property owner's ability to undertake alterations and additions to a home. And that's something that's based on wider case law, not just a position from council. Next, thanks. And so now we're going to go through the questions that were received and any further questions that might come up. And I think I'm right in saying that we're happy to, given that there's not a large number of people here tonight, we'll actually, rather than relying solely on the chat, if you would like to kind of verbally put your question, please just put your hand up, and if you know where that function is, it's just down on the bottom. We'll make any sort of reaction at all, and we'll try and open up for you. But we're going to go through the pre-registered questions first. And I'm going to invite Stevie Myers to go through some of these questions. Next slide, please. Stevie, if you're there.
Yes.
Great.
Thanks, Ross.
Take us through.
Okay, so we've got about 4 or 5 questions. So I'll take you through them all the ones on the slide today, and then we can open up to the room, I suppose, if you've got any further points of clarification or different questions. So one of the common ones that we hear from residents in the precinct is, why have I not heard about this earlier? You know, that's a very fair question. When you look at our timeline, it's pretty clear that work has been, you know, progressing for a number of years now. But that's often the case for all, well, council strategic planning projects at least, is that we go through a process of preparing background studies and other types of strategic justification to support a planning approach. And it's not until later in that process that we then take it through the planning scheme amendment and consult the public. So in this case, council actually only made a formal decision to proceed with the heritage amendment in late April this year at the April 26 council meeting. Then what happens is we seek authorisation from the planning minister to actually proceed with the amendment before our exhibition. So again, there was a period of waiting after that. And we received that authorisation from the planning minister only in June this year. So since that time, we've been actively preparing for this engagement, including the mail out that you would have received in your inboxes, you know, letterboxes, and yeah, and we've obviously extended the submission period in response to community inquiries too. Next question. Will owners be exempt from planning application fees? So normally all planning fees are set under the Planning Environment Act and the Planning and Environment Regulations. So all the fees, you know, across Victoria are the same, and they're sort of set, and council essentially, you know, has to charge for them in order to provide that service. However, there is an application you can make to have the fees waived for extenuating circumstances, and we can consider that on a case-by-case basis. So please get in touch if you're interested in this and what criteria we can consider. So how did the building at 31 to 33 Cromer Grove affect this amendment, and why not just protect 31 to 33 Cromer Grove? So that's the church manse, if you're not familiar with the address. So it is true that our initial heritage investigations started with the church manse. However, our preliminary investigations found that it was not at that really high level of individual significance to warrant an individual heritage overlay just on that property boundary. However, the heritage advisors did determine or flag at that time that it's the surrounding precinct, so the surrounding area, was remarkably intact, and it could form part of a larger precinct-based heritage overlay. So since that initial study, we've then undertaken a couple more heritage studies to I guess, investigate that line of inquiry, and it has found that
this whole area is worthy for heritage protection, not just the church manse. So this heritage overlay is not being pursued for the sole purpose to protect the church manse. Now that, you know, council has a duty to identify and protect heritage that it identifies over time. Now that we've identified this heritage area, we've got a duty to see it through and protect it. Similarly, we know there are probably lots of other gaps in the Darebin heritage framework, so it's really not unusual for this kind of investigation to eventuate in a new heritage precinct. What we're hoping to do in the next couple of years is undertake a more, I guess, proactive heritage gaps analysis for the whole municipality, and try and find out if there's actually any other precincts like Thornbury Park Estate elsewhere in the municipality that need protecting, and other potentially individually significant places too, like churches, and potentially individual dwellings and sometimes industrial buildings. Why protect just one side of the street, for example, Miller and Straddle? So as Anthony mentioned earlier, the boundaries have been determined by heritage experts. So you can't apply the overlay where there's not heritage value identified, and this precinct largely corresponds with the actual original subdivision, which makes up part of its heritage significance. Also, it is often the case that one side of the street might be more intact than the other, and that's partially, or it could have been developed at a slightly later period. So there's various reasons why you'll get one side of the street in and not the other. It's not unusual at all. Will council offer a grace period for people who are already in the process of applying for permits? So we are in the process of, or the minister is currently considering an interim heritage overlay. And once that is gazetted into the scheme, there is no grace period. However, not every property that is being considered for a permanent heritage overlay will have an interim heritage overlay applying. So we've excluded the non-contributory properties, which is the grey properties in the map. And we've also excluded properties where demolition permits have already been approved, or a planning permit or other building permits have already been approved by council. So this includes sometimes sort of the rear building permits to the rear of the house. So that means that even though there's a permit for the rear of the house, which may result in some demolition and rebuilding, the front of the house will still remain, and therefore we're not considering it for the interim heritage overlay, but it will remain in the permanent heritage overlay. So essentially there's two different levels of overlays that will apply. If you think you fall into this category of already having received any type of sort of building or planning permit permission from council, then please get in touch and we can consider your circumstances. So can I apply to have my property exempted from the proposed heritage overlay? So yes, essentially we're in a consultation phase and you can make a submission through this planning scheme amendment process. If you provide us with information about why you don't believe your property should be included, particularly information about its heritage value, including, you know, when it was built or when modifications have been made to it that may have not been picked up in the heritage assessment, then that's the type of thing that we can definitely consider through this process, and it could result in either change in the grading of your property, so for example from contributory to non-contributory, or even if, for example, there's sections of a streetscape that are no longer deemed as significant, then potentially the boundaries could change too. You'll also have a chance to present your case at an independent planning panel through this process too, who will then make recommendations to council to consider before we finalise the amendment.
Thanks, Stevie. Just before we open up, there was an additional question that came in quite late as well, which was, it's just in the chat there, but how has the community's connection to this area been evaluated? And what circumstances has Darebin concluded this is a site of significance other than the age and design of buildings?
No problem. I can, I'll answer that one. I might just get through this page first.
Oh, sorry. I thought we were done with that. No, that's fine. Sorry, apologies for that.
All good.
Yeah.
So how does the proposed heritage overlay fit with Council's climate emergency declaration? This has been a really frequent question. So it is, I guess, our advice that high sustainability standards and heritage protection are not mutually exclusive, and they're both important to Council. So we can confirm that a heritage overlay won't prevent building renovations to enable you to modify your dwelling to reach really high efficiency standards. There's also, so essentially what it means is that you can, while you retain the front facade and potentially the front couple of rooms, you can make substantial modifications to the rear of the building to really improve some of those environmental efficiency standards. And there are things you can do to the heritage building too, to also make it more efficient than it is now. In addition to that, there's actually a substantial body of research that shows overall that actually retaining existing buildings has really significant sustainability benefits, because what it does is it actually reduces energy usage associated with demolition, waste disposal and new construction, and the embodied energy that's, I guess, goes into creating new materials and new buildings. So yeah, when you consider it from that perspective, it's actually quite sustainable to retain existing buildings too. What if my property is not structurally sound? So this is a very common one. If your heritage building is structurally unsound, this won't mean that your building is not suitable for the heritage overlay. What it means is that it's something that's considered during the planning permit process with advice from a structural engineer. So you might be included in the heritage overlay because your property is of, has identified significance. And then that triggers a planning permit later on, where you essentially make a case for whatever your proposed development is to council through that process. If you can support that planning permit application with evidence that your property is structurally unsound from an expert like a structural engineer, and then that's confirmed as suitable by our own heritage advisor, then you may actually be able to demolish and rebuild even with a heritage overlay applying to your property. So these are the questions that we received today. So some of you would have definitely put these questions forward. So if renovation was required to the front fascia of a building due to deterioration, would there be a body within council that could advise on a suitable design and replacement? So yes, council has a heritage advisor that can provide advice on any proposed works to a heritage place. what I suggest is that you come to the planning counter or have a pre-application meeting with council. It's free, to determine whether or not what you have in mind will actually require you to lodge a planning application or not. So the permit trigger is if you carry out works, repairs and routine maintenance which change the appearance of the heritage place, then you need a planning permit. So generally, if you're replacing like for like, so the same details, same specifications and same materials, it could be that you don't need to go through the permit process, but it's always good to check with council first. So next question, was a neighbourhood character overlay considered rather than a heritage overlay given the transience and diversity of the area? So these two things, neighbourhood character and heritage, are similar but very different planning considerations and also different planning controls. So neighbourhood character is less about the detail of building design and more about the building form, scale and setbacks. Everywhere in Darebin has a neighbourhood character, but not everywhere in Darebin is of heritage significance. So with neighbourhood character, buildings don't need to be old or historically significant to sort of have a character. Whereas heritage is largely embodied in the actual fabric and setting of a building and place. So it's really the sort of the finer details of the place. Yeah, and while all areas have a history or heritage, not all areas are historically significant. So the actual identification of Thornbury Park Estate as a significant place has been undertaken or identified through a process of quite rigorous assessment against recognised criteria that's set by Commonwealth, state and local agencies with reference to the Borough Charter. So I hope that helps answer that question. And how do we retain our heritage and character of an area without everybody wanting to modernise everything? Why do people move into an area because they like the area and then want to change everything? Thanks for your question. So it sounds like you're supportive of the proposed heritage overlay, maybe. That's essentially the purpose of the heritage overlay. It's to largely retain and protect good and intact examples of the late Federation, interwar and post-war dwellings and period house designs. Where these properties are not contributory to the heritage significance though, some modern houses will be suitable if they're designed in a sympathetic manner. So this is because often contemporary architecture or innovative design can play a positive role in a heritage streets context. So where it's well designed, new work can, I guess, have that positive role in the interpretation of heritage significance through a clear layering of different eras. So this is often more desirable to have quite a modern addition or infill building, kind of like the examples that Anthony showed you a bit earlier, than having actual mock heritage houses or houses that look like they are heritage but they're not, because this actually distorts and distracts from the real heritage streetscape. And of course, protecting places that are important to us and the history of Darebin allows us to celebrate and highlight the special interest to us as a community so that current and future generations can also enjoy them. So it's important to retain our historical buildings. And the last question that's not on here, that Ross verbalised earlier, I'll repeat it again for your benefit. How has the community's connection to this area been evaluated? Under what circumstances has Darebin concluded this is a site of significance other than the age and design of the building? Again, thanks for your question. the identification and justification for heritage places and areas is a really well-defined and regulated process. So heritage areas are identified based on universally recognised heritage criteria and a comparative analysis of similar places to determine whether or not it actually meets the threshold for inclusion in a heritage overlay. So it's quite a rigorous and strict process, and it's certainly not able to be applied just anywhere. Community views are considered during this process, more this current process, which is the planning scheme amendment process. So council will consider all submissions made to this amendment and will respond to this at a council meeting as sort of a next step. And that includes making a decision whether or not to proceed with the amendment or whether to sort of refer submissions that can't be resolved to an independent planning panel and proceed with the amendment. So hopefully that answers your questions. And I might hand back over to Ross.
Thanks, Stevie. Hopefully, those of you who did put some of those questions in when you registered have had those answered now. But we've got some time available, and as I said, given that it's sort of only 5 or 6 people, I think if anyone would like to ask a question of Stevie or Anthony or Sophie, if you'd like to just sort of raise your hand, and we'll work through them before wrapping up this evening. Is there any questions? Not seeing any hands go up. Could we flick to the next slide, please? Just to see if there's any of this sort of prompts anything from anyone, but the next steps in late 2021, council will so for the rest to the end of this year be considering submissions. If those submissions can't be resolved, they'll be going to an independent planning panel. That will likely take place in early 2022, and anyone making submissions can attend the hearing and present their case. The panel then considers submissions and makes recommendations. And then in mid-2022, council will be then considering recommendations of the panel report and deciding whether to request approval of the amendment from the Minister for Planning. So as you can see through that, three key steps, and there's still a fair amount of work to be done so far until that point. Next slide, please. So for further information, and obviously if any of you do have any further questions about what has come out from tonight, or equally any of your neighbours do, or any of your any people in your community, you can find out more information about the proposed planning scheme amendment by meeting with council officer to discuss changes. You can visit the council's website at www.yoursaydarabin.com.au/Thornbury Park Estate, emailing the team at planningservices@darabin.vic.gov.au, or calling the strategic planning team on either 8470 8494 or 8470 8461, and that will be talking directly to the team working on this project. I'm gonna do one last call for any potential questions. I don't want to leave anyone unsatisfied for the evening before I let everyone go and have your evening meals. So any final questions anyone has? No? I think that's our last slide, isn't it, Jess? Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for everyone's time this evening. We do appreciate it. We appreciate you taking the time to learn about this and hear about the heritage amendment.